Is December really busy in terms of recruitment, or it's easier?
Um, we always tell ourselves that it's going to be quiet or that it will go quiet. For Saudi in particular, that just isn't really true at all. It kind of plows on throughout. Of course, lots of expats do leave the region for at least a week or two. So things tend to slow down as we get closer and closer towards the end of the year. But yeah, certainly not a slowdown in the way that you would get in other markets.
It's not the slowdown. Cool. So we are live and we already have people joining us. Thank you everyone for joining in. So I guess we'll start. We'll start on time.
Sure.
Hi everyone, welcome to the Finance Story LinkedIn Live series where we bring you in industry experts to help you build a better career. So today we have with us Joe Robinson, who's the head of professional services for Saudi Arabia at Robert Walters. Joe, thanks a ton for joining in. Thanks for the time.
Thank you for having me, Chantal.
Thank you. And everyone who's joined in, thank you so much for making the time. If you have any questions, please comment and we'll take the questions right away. Okay. So Joe, could you tell us a little bit about yourself? Like why did you move to Dubai in 2019 and what got you here?
Sure, thank you. So I think like most people in the region, obviously was in the UK, which is where I'm from, but like most people looking at the Middle East, endlessly looking at all the opportunity here, looking at all the growth here, and thinking that's something that I would like to be a part of. For me personally, I had known for a long time that I wanted to experience living somewhere else, and that had always been a part of the plan. Hadn't always known that that would be the Middle East or the UAE, but the more research I did and the more I started to look at it, the more it became where I wanted to be. And I was very fortunate at the time that I was working for a business that had an office here, and I was able to transfer with the organization. So I was very lucky in that sense.
That's amazing. That's amazing. So Joe, my question for you is, what's your role at Robert Walters, and what kind of clients do you guys hire for, and what's your team size, especially in the Saudi market?
So I run a few different teams here. Those are accounting and finance, so that's specifically for commerce and industry. Then a banking and financial services team, and the third one is a legal recruitment team. Across our full Saudi specific division, we have about 15 people. And that, aside from the parts of the business that I run, that also includes HR, sales and marketing, technology, procurement. So yeah, we cover a lot of different areas within businesses. In terms of clients that we partner with, we're very lucky to be able to partner with lots and lots of different types of organization. So we work with large public sector organizations, ministries, giga projects and mega projects within the kingdom as well. Lots of private sector businesses though also. So we are very fortunate to be in a position where we help multinationals, for example, who are setting up their Saudi businesses or their regional businesses for the first time, and we're able to give them some insights to try and make that journey easier, as well as, of course, finding people to help them establish their businesses.
Okay, so there's a lot of people joining in. Please ask your questions, comment, and we will address it right away. Okay. So my next question for you is, can you give us? There's a lot of talks about Saudi, especially in the last quarter. You could say in the last 2 quarters, everybody wants to know what's happening there. What are the opportunities there? I see a lot of people in India, in Canada, in Dubai, of course, who wants to know that how could they make the move and what is it different for them? Like what does it have to offer? But before that, could you give us an overview, like a little bit of an in-depth overview about the Saudi market? I mean, we know a lot of MNCs being set up there, but would you want to highlight and go a little in depth for us to get a better idea?
Sure. Okay. So if we're talking about 2023 as a whole, the initial period of the year probably was a very slight slowdown and through to the mid part of the year when we compare it to what had gone before. But that doesn't mean anything negative in terms of the market in general. There's no kind of association or connotation from that. It's purely just that ever since we kind of came out of that slump at the back end of COVID, we've been in such an accelerated market when it comes to hiring, when it comes to expansion for businesses, when it comes to growth, that everything that's happened since then has been at this real accelerated trajectory and pace. And therefore, we needed a little bit of a correction and coming back to some kind of normality within the market. So we saw that early on this year. And to a lot of people, that felt like it had become a slow market or it become a more negative or cautious market. But I think if you look at markets globally, if you look at what's happening to economies around the world, we're in a really great place here in the Middle East, and that is true of the whole region. And of course, I'm very fortunate that the area I look at is Saudi Arabia, and Saudi is absolutely kind of leading the way from a regional perspective and almost globally, to be honest, in terms of the amount of growth, the amount of investment, the amount of ambition that's being demonstrated within that market. There have been changes as a result of that kind of, I don't think slowdown is the right word, but as I say, correction maybe, in that the type of hiring that's been happening has changed, and it's perhaps gone back to being slightly more strategic, slightly more targeted and focused. Whereas for a lot of the last 18 months, 2 years, we were finding that companies would come to us with large volumes of hiring and very ambitious plans. I would speak to hiring managers and directors and CFOs within businesses, and they would say, I have a budget that I'm adding 50 heads to our business in H1. Now, when we have those conversations, that's slightly more pragmatic in the way that it can be in a more settled market, where they maybe are saying, we're adding 10 heads in our budget and we have the potential for a further 7 in key spaces, as opposed to that real high volume of stuff. But in general, this market is in a fantastic place. Saudi, of course, being the leading light of that. And when we talk about people from other markets who are looking at this region, there's obviously no surprise that people want to be here and want to be a part of that opportunity and to take advantage of that opportunity. So from a job seeker's perspective, the Saudi market and the Middle East in general are incredibly buoyant, incredibly full of opportunity, but they are also incredibly competitive. The vast majority of us who are on this call today, and the vast majority of us who work around the region, will be expats. We will have come from somewhere else in the world, and we will have come because we wanted to be a part of what was happening here, and for the opportunity that presented to us, whether that's professional, personal, financial. There is no shortage of people in all the places that we came from who want exactly the same thing. So it's a strong market, it's a buoyant market, but it's a competitive market as well. It doesn't mean it's easy to find jobs necessarily.
That's amazing. So, Joe, can you just give me a little bit of a breakdown? Give all of us a little bit of the breakdown, industry-wise, sector-wise. Like, what's been the growth sector-wise? Say consumer, F&B. Like, if you could just break that down for us.
Yeah, absolutely. So we talked about how the Saudi market has been massively expanding. There's been a lot of effort put into almost every aspect of that Saudi market over the last few years. If we look back 5, 6, 7, 8 years to the launch of Vision 2030 and all of this government-led investment, that then has translated through to almost the next phase of that with a lot of the PIF companies over the last few years and the investment from there. And that then goes on one step further in that it's all then triggered a huge amount of private sector investment. So what all of that means is that there's a lot more people in the Saudi market in exactly the same way that we saw if you go back a few more years for the UAE market and other regional markets in the GCC. And that means that more people need more services. So you mentioned consumer goods there. Consumer goods as an industry has grown around 23, 24% in the last 12 months. Similarly, other things that are service sectors that are there to cater to a larger population. So if you think about facilities management, HR, F&B, entertainment and leisure, all of these things are around about 7 or 8% in each of those industries up year on year. And that is a direct correlation to the investment that's led to the population growth and then causes all of that growth as well.
Okay. Would you want to talk a little bit about the banking industry? How's the banking industry shaping up, and are they looking for expats, or what's the hiring in the banking sector overall?
Yeah. So I guess you've said banking there. I guess you can split that slightly further to be talking about banking and financial services more broadly. Banking is going through a really interesting change in that apart from a couple of major banks, most of the more global multinational banks had kept relatively small operations in Saudi. I say relatively small, some of them still sizable, but a lot of the very well-known household names hadn't necessarily invested in huge offices and huge headcounts. That is something that is changing. That is something that's going to happen a lot over the next year or two. We've seen a very similar thing. If you look at a couple of other similar industries, for example, law firms, there are a huge amount that are opening offices in Riyadh at the moment. And this is all driven by law changes and policy changes specifically to trigger that. The financial services sector more broadly, in terms of investment and capital, has been massive in the kingdom for a long time, and just pretty much goes from strength to strength. Obviously, all those businesses get more and more mature, so perhaps the type of growth that they deliver is less shocking in terms of percentages because they are dealing from a larger base and a more mature base. But we also see, because of the amount of private wealth within the kingdom, that we see new businesses opening in this space all the time, and therefore there is constant change and constant activity within the market because those people are looking for talent. You mentioned there about the workforce in terms of expats. Of course, within the kingdom, there's a lot of pressure in terms of Saudization. We see that as well in the UAE with Emiratization, but there's a fairly dramatic difference between Saudization and Emiratization purely because of the breakdown in demographic of the population in the two countries. For expats, the Saudi market is fantastic, and there is a huge amount of opportunity, huge amount of potential. There is an element of challenge in that the Saudization part is much more effective than the Emiratization piece. So depending on the types of businesses that you're applying to, you may find there are some which are quite heavily reserved towards Saudis, but that's generally when we look at things that are involved in public funding or the public sector in some way. Private sector, it's very much a case-by-case basis. Companies, of course, have the target that they need to hit in terms of the proportion of Saudi nationals within their businesses, but it goes very much by industry. I mentioned law firms as an example. We work with a lot of law firms who've got some fantastic Saudi national partners and senior associates, that kind of level, and therefore they have pretty much complete flexibility when it comes to hiring because they've met their criteria. Other businesses that haven't been as proactive on that and are having to play catch up will tend to say almost any new role that comes through, they focus very heavily on Saudi nationals. So it really depends on a case by case basis. The other thing I would say is that we'll probably talk about this a few times as well. Knowing what your skill set is and knowing what makes you stand out is the most important thing in terms of being able to differentiate yourself, whether the criteria is around nationality or anything else. If you have a skill set that makes you not necessarily unique, but in some way out of the ordinary and in some way more valuable than just the basics of the job that you do, that's huge and can really open up doors for you. So lots of clients will ask us for Saudi nationals as a shortlist, but if we show them expats who absolutely meet their requirements and possibly even exceeding their requirements, they will still talk to them for sure.
That's amazing. Joe, you earlier mentioned, you were talking to clients who wanted to increase their headcount, like say, I want 50, 50 heads of, a particular company, right? So what are these companies that they were hiring, had this massive hiring going on? What kind of companies, if you would want to talk a little bit about on that aspect?
Yeah, I was giving that example as an idea of kind of the slightly more crazy hiring that was happening as we came post-COVID, and the way that a lot of companies who may well have shrunk during that real recession period and the pandemic and the lockdown and all that kind of phase were then bouncing back from that by heavily investing to try and take advantage of effectively an opportunity to gain market share, because of course lots of businesses very sadly were not able to sustain through that period, and in the same way lots of people were really negatively affected and therefore lost their jobs, and that put a surplus of talent back into the market. So there was an opportunity for aggressive hiring for a lot of organizations. If we're talking about companies that are taking that kind of volume approach and that aggressive approach on a more long-term basis, then of course you're only talking about very large businesses, because a small business isn't going to be adding 50% of its workforce every year or anything crazy like that. We work with some of the largest businesses, both public and private sector, within the kingdom, and of course they hire a huge amount of people every year because they have, in some cases, tens of thousands of employees. The other aspect in terms of businesses that might hire that aggressively and in that sort of volume would be, as I mentioned, companies who are really establishing themselves either for the first time or deciding that they are comfortable to really establish themselves for the long term. So I touched on earlier how some businesses may have a very small footprint in the kingdom, and historically that was something we saw a lot of, that businesses wanted a presence in the kingdom but perhaps didn't understand the culture, perhaps weren't as comfortable in terms of understanding how they were protected legally, financially, and therefore they had a very small operation and they chose to base more people in markets that they understood better. Now, I think partly from a combination of the fact that, as I mentioned, the government in the kingdom have really heavily worked hard on changing laws, changing policies to make sure that they are in the most competitive position they can be to attract business and to demonstrate why there is value there for businesses and why they should respect that and invest in it for the long term. But also just because we can all see what's happening in Saudi, we can all see the amount of investment, the amount of growth. People talk, certainly in the networks that I move in every day, about how exciting the changes are and how dynamic the Saudi market is all the time. And bluntly, I think we've reached a stage where for most businesses, they have to be a part of that. It's not a choice. If you're not getting involved, you're getting left behind.
That's so true, because I see a lot of businesses in Dubai, a lot of businesses in India. They're talking about, hey, do I open an office in Saudi? I don't want to miss the entire growth that's happening there. So it's getting everyone curious, and everyone's asking that question. So
Yeah,
that's for sure. Okay, Joe, we'll start taking questions, because they will overlap with, I guess, my questions. We have this question from Taksim. He says, I've been looking for a role at credit risk or corporate banking segment in the KSA, even the UAE, despite having over 12 years of experience of working in an MNC bank, which is also present in the GCC. Something is not working right. So can you guide him a little bit?
I can try. Hi, Taxim. So thank you for the question. Look, first and foremost, there is absolutely no getting away from the fact that it's really hard being a job seeker, someone who's looking for a job. Hopefully, you're doing that from somewhat of a position of strength, in that you're in a role and you're looking for something that you feel would be better or more suited to you, or would progress your career. But as we all know, there are lots of people who are doing that from a more distressed position, whether it's that you've lost your job, whether your company is going through financial difficulties, whether there are concerns about your long-term future, whether you're just not happy. It's not easy being in that position. And absolutely, as recruiters, we recognize that. There are things that you can do, and there are things that you can do to try and give yourself the best possible chance. You can't guarantee anything, unfortunately, and I can't guarantee anything, and I'd be lying if I pretended that that was something that was in my control. What I would say is that you've mentioned that you do credit risk, corporate banking. I don't know you, so I haven't seen your profile, I haven't seen your CV. Those are sectors that are in a good place in the region at the moment. I wouldn't say they're necessarily the most rapidly expanding sectors, but they're certainly not diminishing by any sense, and there's no reason why that should in itself be a challenge. The theme that I'll probably keep coming back to as I talk to people throughout this call today is that you need to make sure you're very clear about what makes you stand out. So I mentioned this before. You, I would imagine, are probably quite a well-qualified individual. I think you said you've got 12 years of experience, so great. You've got a strong background in that case. But without any disrespect to you, you're by no means the only person in the region who has 10, 12, 15 years of experience within your skill set, within your market, within what you do for a living. Now, you might have skills and experience which do make you different to other people, or you may have been through changes in a business or worked in types of business that do make you quite different to your peers. And that's the kind of thing that you really need to be pulling out. If you are applying for roles which are being applied for by 1,000 other people who have a similar kind of background to you, or even 100 other people who have a similar kind of background to you, that's a pretty low chance of success for you. And that's the problem that you have. So you've asked about how to attract recruiters. The biggest thing is that you need to be clear for yourself what makes you different and why people should think about you in a different way to necessarily any of the other dozens or hundreds or even thousands of people who might have a similar background. Once you can answer that question for yourself, you can answer that question for a recruiter, you can answer that for a hiring manager, you can answer it for a talent acquisition person within a company that might interest you. And therefore you can begin to sell yourself in a more productive way. We get across my whole team, we probably get hundreds of messages a day from largely quite well qualified and experienced professionals. And we do our very best to engage with as many of these people as possible, to respond, to give them at least helpful advice if we can't necessarily represent them. But the problem is that for most of them, those messages are pretty similar, those LinkedIn profiles are pretty similar, the CVs are pretty similar, and therefore you need to find a way to stand out. So point number one is absolutely make sure that you know clearly what makes you different and why that should matter. Point number two is take that proactively to the people you want to talk to. So if you're approaching recruiters like me, As I say, I get a lot of messages from people that mostly look the same. If I get a message from someone that says, "Hi, can you review my CV?" I'll open it as long as I have the time. And if there's something in there that I think I can do something valuable with, or that makes that person stand out in some way, I might send them a message and say, "Sure, let's have a call." But if it is just pretty much a copy and paste of CVs that I see dozens of times every day, I can't justify the investment of speaking on a phone call or a meeting with every single one of those people. So make yourself stand out, sell that to someone immediately. Don't make them have to go and do the work in terms of finding out why they should talk to you. Put that clearly in front of them from the outset. Next point, don't just focus on attracting recruiters and doing it that way. Think for yourself about where do you want to go? Why do you want to do it? How do you want to do it? And therefore go and start looking at who those people are that could make that happen specifically. So I work in recruitment. I've worked in it for a long time. I believe passionately that it's a great industry and it adds a lot of value for a lot of people. But we can't help everyone and we won't help everyone because it's just not realistic. So as a job seeker, your first point of call and your mindset should be, I'm going to go and try and attract the people who can help me, but I'm going to assume I have to do this myself. And if you work from that basis, you'll set yourself up to target people proactively and you'll get a lot further ahead. And therefore, when you do get the help, it's that help that maybe just pushes you over the line rather than being in a position where you're kind of reliant on others. The way I would do that would be pick companies that you want to work for, pick industries you want to work for, use LinkedIn. It's a fantastic resource. Find the individuals within those businesses, send them a message that says why they should consider your profile aside from others, and then say to them, do you have opportunities within your team that would suit me? If not, are there other people within your business who you could connect me to who might have opportunities? If there are no opportunities now, what is the way that you got hired into this business? Because I would love to work for this specific business. I want to know about your experience. These kinds of questions, rather than just sending a profile, can you help me? That kind of thing. It makes you stand out in a much better way. That would be my advice.
That's amazing. So from what I understand is you're telling Taksim to actually not just rely on recruiters, because it's not possible that there are a lot of factors that get into it, but to actually approach the business heads, the guys recruiting directly in the organization, and network. You're saying network and building a relationship is really important, right? It's a key
Absolutely, yeah. I
factor.
think it's a combination of all of those things is what's going to give you your best chance of success. As I said, the bottom line is there's no getting away from just that finding jobs in a competitive market is really difficult, right? So if talking to a recruiter and building a relationship with them and getting their attention maybe gets you 10% closer to where you need to be, you need to think about where you're finding your next 10% and the 10% after that. And if that means using fantastic resources like this with you, Chantal, and the finance story, and the people that can come through networking events like the ones that you operate in person, as well as obviously LinkedIn live interviews and all that kind of thing, that's really valuable. Target companies you want, connect with them directly, ask those questions. At the very least, it will make you stand out a little bit from the crowd of people who are just sending an application or just clicking apply on a job advert. And it's improving your odds. That's the best you can do.
Okay. I just have two follow-up questions. The first one is, do you have to be present in the region to apply for roles? Because in Dubai, if you're in Dubai, it's always preferred, right? People always prefer a candidate who's locally available, right? Because you've taken the risk, you've taken the chance, and you're here. So is it the same in the Saudi market? Also, the second one with respect to the banking domain, like in the UAE, right? We don't see a lot of recruiters hiring for the banking industry. There are 45 banks, but most of the roles are filled, through referrals or net internal movements, correct? Unless it's a senior role. So do you see the same in Saudi as well, or it's different? Like, do you have a lot of banking clients?
We do have a lot of banking clients. Yeah, I mean, we have effectively two dedicated banking teams. So hopefully that tells you that there are plenty of banks and similar businesses within that space who are using agencies. And whilst I would love to imagine a world where we are dominating the market to the extent that our teams are the only ones, we have plenty of competitors in the region as well. So there is an awful lot of recruitment being done through agencies by banks. So absolutely, recruitment agencies, whether it's Robert Walters, whether it's our competitors, are in a position to help you and will do their best. But as you rightly said, there are a lot of roles, particularly at the more junior levels and the mid levels within the banking sector, that do get filled directly by these organizations, do get filled through referrals and personal networks. You've got to remember that to use any kind of consultancy, whether that is recruitment, whether it's strategy, whether it's audit, any of these things, it costs money for a business, right? So they are going to have an element of their business where they think they can handle that themselves. And that's fine. From our perspective, our role is to be a partner to organizations for whatever area of their business they feel they would benefit from having us help with. We don't want to take over the entire operation of running their business, because then we just do what they do. We're not doing what we do.
Yeah.
So our specialism is to partner with a company and understand which bit they're not good at. And we have specialists who are good at almost every different aspect of the market. And therefore, we partner that specialist with that client. That's the aim for us. To come back to your other part of your question, or maybe to finish that part first, there's a reality that, again, that networking piece is huge unless you are at a very senior level, or unless you are someone who has a very specific skill set. If you have that really specific skill set, we can really easily proactively market you to banks, to financial services institutions, UAE, Saudi, across the whole of the GCC. It's the same story. In that situation, of course, we can support you in any scenario. If you're in a more straightforward standard role, you need to be relying on internal talent acquisition teams and network referrals. Then the other part of your question was about the importance of being in the region.
Yeah.
Clearly it makes a difference, right? Of course it does. From a risk perspective for an employer, if you are moving someone here who is outside the region, potentially has never lived in the region, your risk factor there is significantly higher, that something might change. They might panic and change their mind and decide they don't want to leave home. They might have a family situation that means they suddenly can't leave home. Maybe that some part of their family doesn't want to make the move and it throws things off. There's all kinds of reasons why that potentially doesn't work. And of course, the simple fact that that person, no matter how smart they are, how good their skill set is, they don't know the region. They haven't necessarily got to grips with the local culture, the local way of doing things. In some jobs, of course, that matters more than others, but it is still a factor, no matter what. And then the last aspect of that is just, as you rightly say, people who are here already, they've done it, right? They've made the leap, they've kind of taken that jump, and they've instantly added that little bit of value, because they can say, well, I have regional experience, I know this market, I have worked in this market, I might have contacts in this market. I'm adding value from that point of view. Doesn't mean that if you're not in the region already, that's just a no-go. It means that, again, we talked about how job seeking is hard. It's just another challenge that's making that slightly harder for you, and maybe means you need to work a bit harder and be more proactive and be more targeted in your search in terms of how you're going to make that happen. All the same things we talked about before, you just probably need to do more of them, because that's a challenge against you. The only alternative view to that, I would say, is that there are companies I have worked with who would prioritize people outside of the region from a cost point of view. We all know that salaries in this part of the world are quite high compared to lots of other markets. And therefore, if you're outside the region, you may find that one way of getting you into the region is that effectively you could probably take a role on a salary that still benefits you quite dramatically when you compare it to your country of origin. Certainly for me, when I came from the UK, the salary was immediately better being here, even though it's not as good as it might, or was not as good as it might have been had I been in the region for a period of time already. And that's the same story for lots of people. You'll find that maybe for the first role you take in the region, you probably take a slightly lower salary than you would do if you were here for 5 years beforehand. But every move you make from there, you lessen that gap and you benefit.
That's an amazing point, because I see a lot of people, they don't want to budge when it comes to salaries. They really want to just be like, hey, I'm getting so much, everyone's getting so much in the region, I want the same. But you have to compromise a little bit because you're a fresher in the region, right? So that's a great point. And coming from you, it's amazing.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think it's worth taking.
Yeah, sorry. You were
No,
saying
it's all right.
something.
I was just saying, I think it's worth taking that hit in the short term because it gets you where you want to be for the long term.
Yeah, amazing. That's great. We'll take this question, but I guess you've already addressed this. Are there more opportunities for senior professionals as compared to mid and entry level individuals in banking and the finance service companies? Do you want to take this?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question in that the answer is kind of yes and no, but for completely opposite reasons. So no, in the sense that clearly, if you think about the structure of any organization, the more senior you become, you go further up that pyramid, there are just less roles and therefore less opportunities at that level. So technically, no. However, yes, absolutely. When we're talking about ways to get yourself hired, and ways that certainly if you're looking for support from a recruitment company like ours, or even if you're looking through networks or any other way, If you are someone who is working at that more senior level and you've risen through the ranks within an organization, that also means there are less people who are kind of competitors for you and less people who would be direct peers and you would be competing with to go for those jobs. So in that sense, the number of opportunities that you have rises because people are much more willing to look outside the country that they're recruiting in. So, for example, businesses in Saudi would look across the region for talent at a more senior level or possibly even fully outside the region. Businesses would also perhaps look, this question has referenced banks and financial services, but businesses are also more open to people from slightly different sectors at a more senior level because it does become more about the exact skill set and the level of achievements and the kind of things that person is doing to add value rather than necessarily you need to know this product inside out because you are that much more detached from the product than the seen you get within an organization. But certainly, yeah, we find it easier to proactively help people the more senior they become.
Okay, so if you're a senior professional, it's not challenging to find an opportunity in Saudi because people are still getting used to the concept of, hey, you have to still convince senior folks to move there. From what I've seen and spoken to a lot of people, right? So there is a lot of opportunities.
Yeah, I mean, look, I would say it is still challenging because it is massively competitive. We may talk about this in more detail as we continue, but you kind of hinted there that there's an element of perhaps less desire towards people wanting to relocate towards the Saudi market. And if we go back a few years, then absolutely that was the case, right? So when I first moved to the region in 2019, if you were talking to someone, let's say in Europe or the US or wherever, and you were saying I've got a job opportunity in Saudi, the proportion of times out of 10 that you were getting a positive answer to that versus I've got a job opportunity in the UAE was way, way lower. Nowadays, I really don't think that's the case anymore. Clearly, the UAE is an incredible place to live. It's where I live. And it has a huge amount of opportunity, a huge amount of benefit to living here. As I mentioned, the Saudi government have invested so heavily in terms of law changes, cultural changes, in terms of building more things from a service and a leisure and entertainment point of view. If you've been to Riyadh anytime recently, the amount of construction and redevelopment that you will have seen from even a few months before is enormous. So it is such a more attractive place to live. And therefore, certainly from what I'm finding, given it's what I do every day, I don't see any real difficulty in terms of trying to convince or having to convince people to move to Saudi anymore.
That's amazing. So I hope this has answered your question. I can't see the name. Okay. We have another question from she Eamon. She says, "How's the Saudi market for female expats at an entry level? Is it easy for them to get hired in the financial sector?"
Yep. Thank you, Eamon. Ayman, sorry, I'm not sure how to pronounce that. Um, yeah, this is something that actually I feel quite passionate about, and I really enjoy that. Again, it's a mindset that perhaps people haven't realized how much change there's been in this sense. So, again, if we go back a few years, there were some real difficulties for being a female candidate within the labor force in Saudi. Obviously, not across the board. It's not like Saudi's been in the dark ages up until the last few years. But if we go back certainly 10 years, there were some real challenges with that, and that has persisted. It's something that they've been really working on, really investing in. You would be amazed now how often I take a brief for a role or I sit with a part of my team and we're working with a client. They talk to us about what they're looking for and they say, we really actively want female candidates for this. And that's at all levels in organization, not just entry level. As an example, I was on a meeting on Teams earlier today with a business and I was talking to the group CFO, the group CHRO, the global head of talent acquisition, the country CEO, and the group legal director. Only one of those stakeholders was male. So this is just not so much a thing anymore. I, with that same business, placed a CFO for them in one of their subsidiaries recently, female candidate who they hired in at a senior level. It's something that I'm quite proud of and quite passionate about, that the kingdom's done really well on changing this, and I work with lots of fantastic people, both clients and candidates, females at all levels of organisation, and yeah, I think it's excellent.
That's amazing. The next one is Tosif. He says, "What are the key considerations for somebody looking to relocate to KSA? And as you have worked in the UAE market previously, how does the Saudi market, if you draw a comparison?
Hey, Tassif, thank you. The considerations I mentioned there about the amount of redevelopment and the amount of effort and investment that has gone into making KSA a much more attractive and comfortable place to live. Honestly, they've done a fantastic job of that, and they continue to do so, and that will just keep going from strength to strength. However, clearly, Riyadh right now is not Dubai from a comfort of living point of view, from an expat perspective. Of course, there are also some cultural elements that, depending on where you're from in the world, or your background or your beliefs, may or may not matter to you. And there are some elements of those that within the kingdom are more rigid and more fixed and more strict than in the UAE. You perhaps have more flexibility in the UAE. So again, if those are things that are important to you, or if that type of lifestyle is more important to you, you need to consider that when you're looking at Saudi as an option, and you need to weigh that up versus the career and um, professional development and financial benefits that you're potentially looking at there. Um, in general, I think it's probably just kind of that aspect really in terms of the comfort and quality of living. Um, that being said, again, do some research on some of the things that are available to you in terms of leisure activities and seeing some of the more kind of out in the country parts of the kingdom, getting out of the city a little bit. I deal with lots of people who are expats who are based in the kingdom now, and of course their lifestyle is very different to what it might have been having come from Australia or the US or the UK or India or wherever, because the activities that they might have done elsewhere aren't necessarily available to them, and therefore they look for new things. And you've got people visiting amazing historical living monuments almost in terms of some of these places that have been developed. There's incredible areas of different kind of geographical diversity. You've got jungle in parts of Saudi. You've got some amazing coastal destinations as well. So yeah, there's a lot of positive there, but you need to make sure you've properly assessed it before you make the move.
Okay, well said. We have another question from Tausif. He says, how quickly does a recruitment and onboarding generally take? And what are your thoughts on the length of time it takes and how it compares, to places like the UK?
Yep. So the Middle East in general, the pace of most things tends to be slower than it does in slightly more mature markets like the UK, like Europe in general, the US, etc. Saudi, you kind of get it either one way or the other. So it's either pretty slow and it takes a long period of time, and you just have to accept that that's a cultural thing, and it's because they're going to go through that process, and the stakeholders in that won't be rushed. A part of that is that often you have very senior stakeholders within processes within the kingdom, and it's not uncommon that you might have a very senior person like the CEO of a large business may well get involved in interviews for someone where in other markets that person might not necessarily feel the same level of personal attachment to recruiting across all levels. And therefore, if you're dealing with senior people, it takes time to find slots in their diaries. It takes time to confirm these things. You just kind of have to accept that. The other side of that coin is that very occasionally, and of course this is the minority, but sometimes within the kingdom, a decision is made, and it's we're gonna do this. How quickly can we see the people that meet the brief we're giving you, and how quickly can we find the people who have this skill set, show them to us, we'll make an offer immediately. And obviously that's has its own challenges and is a different type of challenge. So yeah, that would be the outlier, but more generally, yes, you have to accept that the kingdom is a slightly slower pace of business in general.
Okay, so patience is key. It's important to be patient, and but the
Yeah,
process in general takes a while.
I
Okay.
would also say in that sense not to worry. So if you are someone who's involved in an interview process for something that's happening in Saudi, and you've been told that you're going to have a later stage interview, and it's maybe taking a couple of weeks to get that organized, or perhaps something gets reorganized and a further few weeks down the line, don't worry, don't take that personally. Of course, talk to the person who's helping you with that process. So if it's a recruiter, ask them directly just to make sure that you know exactly what is happening and why. But don't panic that that's about you. It's more likely to just be that somebody very senior is involved somewhere in the process, and therefore it's been delayed because they have other things that are happening.
Okay, cool. Thanks, Joe, for answering all these questions. So we'll take a lot more questions later on because I have I have some interesting questions for you as well. Joe, I have this point since we're talking about banking, right? You said you've got a whole banking team. So, what roles are your team currently working on? What are the mandates that you'll have? If you're okay to share.
Yeah, look, we're working on all kinds of different positions. I mean, in the last couple of days, we've picked up a couple of KYC roles with a multinational bank in Riyadh. We've been working on a head of compliance role for a very large investments business. It's actually based in Jeddah. We're working on various different roles with, again, kind of capital investment firm. There's a head of private debt position, which is actually a really interesting one because that's a very unusual role for this region. You don't get a lot of senior private debt positions in the Middle East. So that's quite an interesting search for us. And we may well find, for example, for something like that, that we do look at a candidate coming from potentially London or maybe Singapore, something like that. So that's a great example, actually, of, as we talked about, that niche skill set makes you that much more valuable and gives you that much better odds of standing out. If we were talking about something that was, say, a fairly basic investment manager role, which of course we have lots of live investment manager roles with different businesses, but we don't need to go far to look for those because we already have a database and a network of people that we've worked with before. So in positions like that, we're not having to go out and search broadly. And we're also probably not necessarily taking so many applications for that or going through so many applications and interacting with those people because we have that many already that we're able to put through the people that we've already got to know, we've already worked with and represented. And of course, that's just, it's quicker, it's more efficient, and we have more confidence in that because we have relationships with those people already.
Okay. And what about private wealth? Is there a lot of hiring for private wealth managers as well? Like
Yeah,
relationship man? Okay, there is.
yeah, yeah, lots of that kind of thing. I would say that certainly for Saudi is a much more established space and a much more established sector. Certainly, I refer to how private debt is very unusual. Private wealth, those relationship manager roles, there's lots of them. I wouldn't say it's necessarily, well, I mean, it's growing in the sense that the whole space in the industry is growing, but it's not growing disproportionately. But yeah, there's a good amount of opportunity in that space, I would think.
Okay, okay. We'll just take one last question before I'll hop on to my questions. Amir has this point which says, how's the Saudi market for internal auditors, and is it possible for them to find an opportunity in the internal audit department? I mean, I assume she's talking about the bank. He's talking about a banking sector.
Yeah, I mean, I guess this applies across almost all industries. Doesn't necessarily need to be banking or FS. Internal audit in general, it's not a new thing, right? So it's not like it's massively spiking in the way that we've perhaps seen with tax over the last few years, or that we're now seeing with other more kind of digital transformation type roles, where that's now a very hot topic and that's a new thing. Internal audit has been around for a long, long time, many, many years, not going anywhere. So that's the positive aspect of that. But it means there's not necessarily a pressing desire to go out and find a whole load of people who can do this. That being said, there are, I could find the statistics. We have a fantastic data insights team who give us various different types of information and metrics, and we sell reports to companies that we engage with who want clear market insights, whether that's on their competitors, on markets they're moving into. I could speak to them and find out exactly, but there'll be tens and tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people in internal audit roles in the kingdom. In order to get into that kind of thing, this is an absolutely classic example of what I talked about in terms of making yourself stand out. So clearly, this isn't the forum for you to do it, Wakas, and I wouldn't expect you to here. But my advice would be that if you're looking for internal audit roles in the kingdom, you need to make sure you're really clear about what you've got the best chance of being successful in. Be proactive with those sectors and make sure that when you do that, you're really clear in your message about why they should consider you versus other people. There will be lots of people with an audit background or possibly still in audit who are listening to this today. If you think about the year that you began your training with an audit firm, how many other people did that audit firm hire in the same year as you? How many other offices does that audit firm have globally? And you start to understand how many people there are that you are competing with. I don't say this to make anyone worry or feel down in terms of their job chances. I'm just trying to make the point that you need to look for the things that make you different and make sure that that's what you lead with.
Well said. I hope this helps you, Vikas. We have this. Okay, so I have this question for you. Let's talk about tax, accounting, finance. Because we have a lot of our readers and those watching who are from tax, accounting, finance, and you actually mentioned right now there's been a spike in demand for tax professionals and finance professionals and accountants. So would you want to dig deep into that segment?
Yeah, sure. So obviously tax was a relatively new thing to the region maybe 5 years ago, let's say, with VAT being kind of the starting point for that. Obviously, if we talk about the UAE here, corporate tax is kind of in now, and it's new, but it's very much in its infancy. I think businesses are still, in some cases, assessing how that will affect them. But what that's meant is that at different stages over the last 5 years, let's say, tax has become more and more of a prevalent thing, particularly because we have a lot of businesses in this region that trade internationally, and therefore tax is a very important thing to get right. Um, Certainly, if you've ever interacted with anyone who's worked for an organization either in the UAE or Saudi who've got that wrong, the penalties for doing so can be pretty horrendous. And it's really not a mistake that an organization wants to make, and probably not one they'll ever make twice. So things like that are a real driver for change in terms of the hiring landscape and in terms of the job market. Because when these things happen, that's a chance for professionals in that space to take advantage of that and to not only market themselves from the point of view of increasing opportunity, probably increasing salary quite dramatically, but also making sure that you're utilizing the exposure and the skill set you already have and trading off of that, but also really getting more. Because if you're in a position where you're able to say, I was a part of the implementation of VAT to a whole new region, or I was there when corporate tax came, I managed that for such and such an entity, and this is how we did it across these geographies. That's a huge bonus in terms of experience that if you were, for example, in one of these more mature markets that we've referred to a few times, you'll never get that experience because all of these things have been done. They're all well established, and there are functions and foundations and patterns in place for all of that. So that's one of the real advantages of this region. Um, you asked there as well about accounting and finance. I guess with both of those areas, it depends on finding more of a specialism, and certainly in the accounting and finance side of things, that's something that happens over every couple of years. For anyone who's ever been involved in any kind of CFO group discussion or senior finance professionals, over time you will see that there are hot topics. They change roughly every couple of years. I mentioned digital transformation a few minutes ago. That's absolutely probably the hot topic at the moment. We're running a kind of invitation only event for CFOs in Riyadh in February, which actually kind of sold out its attendance immediately as soon as we started contacting people for that. We had to get a bigger venue, but the message for that one and the key topic for that is all about digital transformation. So I think that demonstrates that there is a lot happening in that space, and therefore, if you're a finance professional at a relatively early stage in your career and you're looking for how you can differentiate yourself, picking things like that, either the hot topic now, or maybe trying to think about what's going to be the hot topic next, and getting yourself an extra certification that relates to that, or asking your boss, what do we do about this, and can I work on that project, or going to your boss with ideas saying, I think we should be talking about digital transformation, and here's how I would do it. Can I be involved in it? These are things that can really advance your career.
Okay, okay, that's cool. We have this question from Ali. He says, as a Saudi national with with a banking experience in the US, what are some advantages or opportunities available to me when seeking finance and banking roles in Saudi Arabia?
Mhm. So the obvious one is US banks, right? If you're dealing with US banks and you have banking experience in the US, then you already know what kind of requirements from a reporting standard, from a compliance standard, they will have in terms of a head office perspective. And that's often the big challenge for particularly US listed businesses, for example. And this, that applies across all industries, not just banking. They are looking for people with that kind of understanding, because what they don't want is to have a satellite office, let's say in Riyadh or Jeddah, even anywhere in the Middle East, that is sending them back data and reporting and information that they have to completely rewrite to be able to amalgamate into their wider consolidations as a business. Um, so that's the obvious thing, that you target businesses that will need exactly that experience. The other thing, though, is I would say it does give you opportunity to really think about what you actually are passionate about long term. Because when you have something like that, which is a very specific bit of experience, you need to kind of think a little bit laterally and say, okay, that's the obvious plug and play. I can just go straight into doing that. But What else utilizes a similar kind of thing? What else, whether maybe it's SOX compliance as an example that you might therefore have had exposure to because of what you've been doing previously? What other businesses have to worry about that? Do I want to be in that space? Is that something I'd enjoy doing? And think about it in that way, because it does give you that many more options. Um, I think the fact that, of course, Ali, you're a Saudi national effectively gives you two real selling points there immediately, and I'm sure you have lots of other selling points in your experience in your CV. I mentioned before that there are lots of banks which are really driving their headcount now in the kingdom, and historically have had smaller headcounts. We're working with a couple of banks at the moment who are looking for finance professionals in terms of their own internal finance, so not from an investment point of view, not from a client's point of view, in terms of operating the finance of their entity. And they would look for Saudi nationals with experience within multinational banks for that. So definitely the kind of thing to look out for.
Okay, cool. Ali, I hope this answers your question. Otherwise, you can get in touch with Joe. I mean, you seem to be an ideal candidate as well. So, yes. Okay, so Joe, I have this, a follow-up question on tax rules. So, if I'm a tax professional, say in the in Dubai, or say in India, or in any other country, I do stand a great chance in Saudi, right? There's a lot of hiring happening. And also, we have a question from Abhishek. What about, head of finance positions in a traditional brick and mortar kind of industries in Saudi Arabia?
Okay, fine. So Abhishek, I'll answer your question first. Saudi is actually a great place to be for this kind of thing because of the amount of government support that's going into a lot of these industries. So you may not be familiar with them, but there are a lot of fantastic public funding entities within the kingdom. So, for example, the Saudi Industrial Development Fund, the National Development Fund, the Agricultural Development Fund, all of these, as the names would suggest, have slightly different focuses in terms of where they invest their funds. But this is effectively government money which is being offered at a very, very competitive rate to businesses, either for a launch or an expansion or diversification. Could also be product launch, product changes. Um, some of these even go to the extent, for example, where you can apply to one of them for funding, and they will also, as part of the funding they may eventually award you, they potentially also award you land for a factory, things like that. So it's all heavily subsidized, and it's a really amazing way of growing these industries. As an example, I'm working on some CFO roles um, with manufacturing businesses um, over in the very east, so near Jubail, Ras Al Khair, if anyone knows that, from Saudi geography. But for manufacturing businesses, we've got one which is with a glass manufacturing business, one which is with an aluminium manufacturing business. And both of those right now have got funding from the Industrial Development Fund. That's come with them getting the land and the approval for a factory. They're launching new businesses effectively. So I would say the kind of industry you're describing there is a really great thing to be targeting in the kingdom. And then I think, Chantel, your other question was about being a tax professional in markets like India or elsewhere. Obviously, if we were having this conversation in 2017 and we were 6 months or 12 months away from VAT being implemented in the UAE, for example, you would you would maybe have a really clear roadmap on exactly what that looks like. Taxation is clearly something, as we've seen both in Saudi and in the UAE, there just keep being new elements to it, right, over the last few years. And that's not going to go away. If anything, there will continue to be more elements of it. It's clearly a skill set, therefore, that is highly in demand, and it immediately improves your chances. If we're talking about I'm a tax professional versus I'm, let's say, run of the mill, and I mean that with no disrespect, but run of the mill chartered accountant with no differentiating factor, there's no surprise there about which one of those is more likely to have a better chance of securing an opportunity. Um, the one thing I would say for Saudi is that, like with the whole of the region, it has its nuances. The Zakat and Tax Authority have a lot of very specific points. So don't fall into the trap of thinking just because you are a tax professional, you know what you're doing with all of it. Bear in mind that you will still need to make that adjustment when you find an opportunity. But as I mentioned before, kind of really critically assess yourself. Where are you at the moment? What can you definitely, absolutely 100% nail and be responsible for? And what are the things that you would need to learn if you were going to be here? And that gives you a bit of a roadmap to start saying, okay, so what do I apply to that gives me the best chance of success?
Okay, okay, that's amazing. So thanks, Abhishek. Also, Joe, would you have any tips for Abhishek? Like you say, okay, the kind of companies he's looking at has great opportunities, but how does he discover these opportunities? I mean, how does he apply for these roles? Do they advertise on LinkedIn, or it's only through a recruiter? Like, how does it flow?
Mhm. So that's the hard part, right? Is knowing about what's happening behind the scenes. Definitely connect with recruiters, connect with me, Abhishek, or with my team, connect with other people who do similar things to what we do across the region. There's lots of fantastic people working across the region. Um, Set yourself up job alerts. This is something that LinkedIn is really great for. You can set up job alerts and give it specifics about the type of jobs you want to know about, the locations you want to be aware of. That is something actually really to consider as well, Abhishek. So I mentioned those roles I'm working on are in Ras Al Khair, which is very much eastern and coastal. Um, it's a very industrial area. It's exactly the kind of place where you would imagine glass manufacturing and aluminium manufacturing businesses to be. This is something perhaps people haven't necessarily considered about the kingdom. Chantal, I know we've talked about this before, that geographically different parts of the kingdom are stronger or weaker for other things. There you go. So um, Riyadh, for example, is very much the hub for financial services, banking, lots of other kind of white collar professional services fields. The law firms, for example, there's an area in Riyadh where I visited a couple of months ago. You effectively can walk all around one square, and every building pretty much is a law firm. So it gives you an idea of that kind of market. Similarly, the eastern province is much more industrial, manufacturing, oil and gas, all of those kinds of things. And if you look at Jeddah, again, it's coastal, it's fantastic for logistics. It's also heavily kind of heavy industries, industrial manufacturing. But because of its location on the coast, because it has a massive port, because of its proximity to the Suez Canal, it's a fantastic hub for logistics and shipping and maritime industries. So you need to think about whether you have criteria for yourself if you want to move to the kingdom, about where you would and wouldn't be willing to live, and think about how that plays into your job search as well.
Okay, that's amazing. So when you talk about locations, you say Riyadh, Jeddah, and what are the other places?
So if you're looking at the eastern region, you've got kind of Dammam and Khobar. They're very close to each other. Um, they're separate cities, very close to each other, quite close to Bahrain. There are, of course, other major. Well, there are lots of other places where businesses are in the kingdom, but those would be effectively your kind of your main hubs.
Okay. Okay. Cool. We have the next one that I have is I mean most of my questions are now answered by you. Okay. So what do you want to touch base on this? If I'm looking for a job opportunity, what should be my strategic job search process? LinkedIn alerts, connecting with recruiter, networking, anything else that we've kind of missed? Being present in the region, maybe.
Yeah, I would say being present in the region if you can is great, but don't put yourself in a more difficult situation to try and make that happen. I've spoken to lots of people who've said that I'm quitting my job where I live and I'm flying over. I'm just going to do loads of interviews, and this region's fantastic in that there are huge amounts of job opportunities and huge amounts of potential. But that doesn't mean that you just walk in and job opportunities land in your lap. So make sure that you are sensible and you protect yourself, and the decisions that you make are with a long term view in mind. Um, as we've said before, the first step is that you need to know for yourself exactly what you want, exactly what you don't want, so that you can be really clear about that. Then you need to build a plan from there. So that means connecting with recruiters, ideally recruiters who specialize in some way in what you've identified as your target. And that when you go to them with a message and a plan that says, this is who I am, this is what I do, and why I am relevant for you, and this is what I want your help with, or this is what I've seen you advertise, and I want to talk to you about that. Doesn't mean that you've got a guaranteed success rate there, but it means that you've done everything you can do to make that as positive and productive as it can be, and you've given the person you're contacting and asking for their help the least amount of legwork to do to at least initiate that process. If you make it difficult for someone because you haven't done the work first, you reduce your chances of success. Similarly, contacting companies directly that you want to work in, looking at the industries that you're targeting. So, if you're a pharmaceutical professional, for example, and you want to work in the kingdom, go and find out who the largest pharmaceutical companies are with the biggest presence in the kingdom, or who has the highest market share, and then find out who works there that would potentially be a line manager for you and contact those people. It's a lot of work, but that's the point, right? Nothing good comes easy.
True that. That's some excellent pointers. Okay, I have this question. There's a perception that salaries, and we've spoken about this, right? Saudi Arabia pays a little more than the UAE. At least it used to earlier. I don't know about right now. So can you give us a little bit of a compensation structure? What's the benchmark one can expect? Like for instance, if I'm in Dubai and I'm a finance guy just starting out, right? Say with 1 to 2 years of experience, or a tax professional, I could expect 10 to 12k, say 8 to 12k, right? If I'm just starting. So if you could just give some benchmarks, that would really help in terms of salary.
Yeah, for sure. Look, maybe we'll stop one step short of giving actual benchmarks in terms of if this is what you do, this is what you should expect. But what I will
Yep.
say is that we have just published our latest salary survey. So if you go to the Robert Walters LinkedIn page, you can download that and have a full read through that. What I will say is that, let's say, for example, you're a professional in the UAE and you're looking at the Saudi market. At the more junior level, the difference that you would expect in salary will be slight, and as you progress further through your career, that difference can be exaggerated. So there is a perception, I think, because of how things have been historically, that salaries in the kingdom are vastly inflated versus the UAE and versus other markets. If we talk about UAE versus Saudi, it certainly used to be the case that the kingdom had to pay a lot more money to attract people, but we've talked already about how that's just not the case anymore, and the kingdom is a much more attractive destination, and people are proactively wanting to be there and trying to make that happen. So there is an awareness within the kingdom that they don't necessarily need to throw money at people in the same way. So there's maybe been a little bit of a correction there. Um, I did speak to our data insights team actually before because I assumed this would come up. So they gave me the latest statistics completely up to date. If we talk about in standardized currency for equivalent job roles, then across all levels, across all job roles, if you look at it as an average, then the difference, Saudi salaries versus UAE salaries, they're about 9% higher, roughly. But of course, that's across everything. It's an average, so it doesn't necessarily tell you the full picture. If you then actually break that down, so you use the example of a finance professional before, um, I don't have the data in front of me for the more junior level of things, but for example, as a mid-level, let's say kind of finance manager candidate, you would probably be expecting probably more like 20% of a difference between the two, roughly. Um, and the more senior you go, again, if we're talking CFOs and senior roles, that difference is probably 30% at the more senior level for the Saudi market versus the UAE. What I would say though is that that correction continues, and I would expect those numbers in terms of the gap to continue shrinking. Feels like a negative word, but I would expect that gap to keep leveling off to the point where there's a difference, but it's not so much of a difference.
Okay. I always thought it's two times, it's double, because everyone tells me, hey, Saudi's paying a lot. So I mean, those who've joined earlier have have been an advantage. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. It used to be, and there was certainly a time when that kind of concept of Saudi being a real hardship market and a hardship destination was was factored absolutely in to compensation. And there's still an element of that. It's still a great place to go to earn a bit more money if you are comfortable with doing so and if that's your priority. But they will, of course, keep looking to not have to invest too heavily in salaries just for the sake of it forever.
Okay. We have this question from James. He says, do you see a pickup in activity in Q1 versus today for experienced CFOs, multi-sector verticals, late 50s?
I know, Paul. Hello, Paul. How are you? Um, yes. So the early part of this year, as I say, it was when we were kind of experiencing that bit of correction in the market from what had been a real boom, um, 12 months prior. And it was one of those things where we have natural highs and lows in the cycle of the year. The end of the year tends to be a period where things get slightly quieter. We talked about this at the very start of the call. This region still continues trading, but obviously a lot of the people that it trades with, or a lot of the expats who work here, travel, and therefore naturally business slows down a little bit as we get to Christmas and the New Year and what have you. Um, there was a concern as we were in Q4 last year that we were all interested to see what would happen when we came back from that little quiet period. We were probably relatively right to be concerned, because although actually things continued relatively well at the start of the year, there was a definite difference versus what had gone before. And earlier this year, things obviously did slow down. I think I was slightly at pains earlier on to stress that just because things slowed down doesn't mean they were bad. It's just that we had been in a real positive booming market as we came out of that post-COVID period, and it's kind of more normalized. I would say this last 2-3 months has been a massive spike in activity across almost all of our sectors. Certainly from our perspective here as Robert Walters, and from the perspective of the clients that we talk to, it feels like people had a little bit of a regroup through the kind of early and mid of this year, and they're then kind of going again. Um, all the same caveats apply in terms of the challenges of getting into roles. You need the right opportunity to be out there for you, right? So it depends on what your skill set is, it depends on what your background is, it depends on what you are looking for and what's important to you. It's obviously for everyone, not just for Paul. Um, there are things that are particularly attractive in the kingdom that perhaps are less attractive elsewhere or that matter more. So, for example, Arabic speakers everywhere in the region are in a great position and are prioritized slightly. In Saudi, that is even more the case, and it's definitely something that's really high on the agenda for a lot of companies because in Saudi, a lot of business is still done in Arabic. Um, the reason for that as well is very simple. If you look at the UAE market, for example, 90% of the population is expat, 10% of the population is local. Therefore, the overwhelming majority of the population, even though some of those 90% are Arabic speakers, the overwhelming majority of those are not. Whereas if we look at Saudi, 60% of the population is Saudi and only 40% expats. So again, when you then consider that there's a pretty healthy chunk of Arab expats in Saudi, you're left with actually a minority of the nation who doesn't speak Arabic, and therefore Arabic speakers are that much further up the list. So it's things like that, just considering where you have your strengths and where you potentially have limitations. But yes, in answer to your original question, yes, there's a good amount of activity right now, and it feels very positive.
Okay. Okay. Thanks, James. So, Joe, I have two follow up questions. Okay. What do you see in 2024? Right, Q1, Q2, Q3. Like, what do you? There's going to be a lot of hiring.
I'll get my
Like,
crystal ball. Um, yes, I think there will be a lot of hiring. I think there will be a lot of activity. For a large part of this year, I think there have been real concerns that lots and lots of markets around the world were going to go into real serious recession. Some of them have been in recession, some of them continue to be in recession. And whilst I wouldn't want to make light of any of that, I would say for a lot of markets and a lot of people, so far, a lot of those haven't necessarily got as bad as they were possibly concerned things might. Now, the nice thing for us in the Middle East throughout that time was that the rest of the world was looking enviously at us and saying, well, these guys are the least affected out of pretty much any region globally, which is a fantastic position for us to be in. There is still an element, and I think this is where a lot of that slowdown did come from earlier in the year as well, that there is an awareness within the region that even though we may be doing fine right now and the rest of the world is suffering, but we're not, you can't be the only one not suffering forever. So if the rest of the world does suffer, then inevitably sooner or later that will have an effect in the region. And I think that was where some of that caution came from earlier in the year. I think the spike in activity now is that, of course, there are lots of geopolitical aspects to this, and there are things happening. We all see the news. We know what's happening around the world every day, and in different geographies and different markets. There are lots and lots of challenges, but more generally speaking, I think more of the world is positive from an economic sense. And therefore, that should translate into continued investment and continued growth. Saudi, it's very easy for me to say that because of how much of that is driven by, as I mentioned, not only the public sector investment that sparked it all, but the private sector investment of companies wanting to be a part of that growth. But for the region in general, that should still be true.
So in short, yes, it's there's going to be a little bit of a slowdown, but it's not bad. It's good. It's a good space to be in. If you're a finance professional, mid to senior, if you're a tax professional, if you're an accountant, there are industries growing. It's booming, right? Because as you said, there's manufacturing being set up. The government is encouraging you to start up, and they're inviting multinational companies to set up businesses, right? So there is a steady growth, but it's not going to be really spiked up the way it was the last, you could say, few years in
Yeah,
some.
absolutely. I would say maybe this feels like a cop out, but looking into next year, I would in general say cautiously optimistic with the cautiously part in very small letters. I am very optimistic about the whole thing, but I'm also realistic that there are enough factors globally that could impact that. then it would be foolish for me to sit here and say the next 12 months is going to be absolutely glorious, because although I would expect that to be the case for a large amount of it and for a large amount of the region, there's enough going on globally that we just need to factor in that element of caution. But yeah,
Absolutely.
we're in a good place.
Okay. My last question is, what are the recent market changes or trends in Saudi that has taken you by surprise?
Yeah, I mean, maybe not necessarily things that have surprised me so much. I mentioned that I'm very proud of the way that women have been really, really heavily built into the workforce in Saudi at all levels. This isn't a brand new thing. This isn't something that's kind of literally just happened. And I wouldn't want anyone to come away from this thinking, oh God, they've only just had women at senior levels in Saudi. But I see it now at such a common level, and like it's not a discussion point anymore, which is just such a refreshing thing to feel. And the amount of times that I meet with senior people, and those senior people are females, and that isn't a surprise, is fantastic. So I think that's a message that I want people to understand about the kingdom, for people who haven't necessarily had as much exposure to it or been there, and therefore maybe are not aware of the more positive changes over the last few years. That's something I would really stress. I talked a little bit before about that Saudiization versus Emiratization challenge, and that is something that I think people need to be mindful of. We talked about how that is purely kind of driven by the demographic in the populations. As I just mentioned, 60% of the Saudi population is Saudi. Therefore, there's a lot more of them who fit into working age, and therefore there's a lot more Saudis who are extremely well qualified, extremely well experienced. So whereas Emiratization is a very minor thing here, Saudization absolutely is something to consider. Doesn't mean that anyone should have fears or concerns about wanting to move into the Saudi market, or should think that that's going to negatively impact them in any way. But it maybe means that you need to think about, as I said, you need to be responsible for targeting your job search and really being strategic about where you want to go and why. If you are someone with public sector experience, you need to make sure you're really clear about what your skill set is and what makes you special, so that you have access to those senior roles. Because actually, if you're just pretty standard within the space that you work in, the reality is there will be Saudis who are at least as well qualified and at least as well experienced, and they are Saudi, so they know the market, and therefore in any kind of public sector organization, it will have a priority, and not unreasonably so. Um, but to give you an example, to give some confidence for why that shouldn't be a concern, there's a candidate that I've known for the last 3 or 4 years, extremely senior guy within audit in the healthcare space, has worked in the UK with the NHS and with government policy around healthcare. I've worked with him on jobs in the UAE. I've worked with him on jobs with businesses connected to the Ministry of Health in the Kingdom. And he has absolutely no problem finding work, because he has a very specific skill set and a specialism. So that's my message, that in almost every aspect of your career, the more you can make yourself specialized and the more you can develop a skill set that makes you stand out, the more options you will create for yourself.
That's excellent. That's amazing. So, I mean, we've asked you a lot of questions. It's almost 1 hour, 15 minutes right now. Do you have any closing message? And if anyone has any questions, we can take up max 2 questions. So that's about it. But Joe, do you have, there are so many others who hold dreams, who want new opportunities, who want to go to new markets. And they're skilled, they're ready, they've got the skill set, but it's a competitive space to be in. So anything would you would like to add in addition to what you've mentioned?
Yeah, I mean, look, I would say the message that I probably want to give to all those people, and I hope I haven't scared anyone or made anyone nervous, put the effort in up front into your own development and your own job search and your career, whether that is around the skills you develop and the qualifications you take on, or the kind of work that you look for and you specialize in, or when it comes to your search, making sure that you're really doing everything you can do to influence that. You're not just clicking apply to things that you see on LinkedIn and waiting for something to fall in your lap. But beyond that, be excited. It's an amazing market across the Middle East. I'm very fortunate that I think I work with the most amazing of those markets in terms of the kingdom. And yeah, people should want to be a part of that. People should be excited to be a part of that, and they should put real effort into looking for that. So yeah, thank you so much for having me, and it's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Joe. I mean, it was really kind of you to join us and answer all these questions. I mean, Tausif sends you a thank you note. And Yeah, we've got another question. If you could just take the last one. What's your take on this? I mean,
Yeah, so yes, the thing is, with all of these Saudization rules, they exist as a policy, and there are policy changes all the time. The government in Saudi work very, very hard on trying to make sure that they are implementing rules and policies and laws to benefit the kingdom as much as possible, but also to do that in a way which attracts companies and does so because it adds genuine value for them. So yes, we are expecting, in fact, some of this is announced already, some of it is still coming in terms of specific sectors and in terms of specific circumstances where the percentage of multinationals required by companies is being relaxed. Karen was absolutely right there. What I would say is try not to worry too much about the cloudization element in terms of it being a hindrance on your career. Just think about that in terms of when you target your search and when you plan for what you want to do next or how you want to be strategic about that. Make sure that you're being sensible about where you should invest the time in your search. Because as we said, job searching is hard, right? And it's a difficult thing to do, and it's an emotionally difficult thing to do. And I speak to lots of people who've been doing this for a long time and who have been trying to find the right thing for a long time. And I get it that it's exhausting. So make sure that you put your effort and your energy into the places where you have the best chance of success, rather than areas where realistically that role will always be for a Saudi national, as an example, because it's a wasted part of energy for you, and you could have put that into something that would maybe give you a better chance.
absolutely. I totally agree. I have this question. I mean, it's not showing up on the screen, but you spoke about law firms. Someone says about law firms. Why there's a rise in law firms in Saudi, especially Riyadh? That's one. And the other one, what about accounting firms, like auditing firms? Is there a lot of, because a lot of companies are growing, expanding. So do they need auditors? Is there a lot of attention on auditing, as as is it an important aspect in business?
Mhm. So, audit firms, we work with three of the big four. I won't say which is the one that we don't work with. Um, we work with three of the big four, and we have placed multiple people with all of them in various different divisions over the course of this year, whether that's audit, whether that's private public partnership roles, whether it's strategy roles. Um, so yes, they are all still expiring. Still expanding, still investing in the kingdom, and that will only continue. Anyone who ever does any work in Riyadh from a consultancy point of view, or who is based in the UAE, if you fly into Riyadh or Jeddah, you sit on those flights and you see that 90% of the seats are taken up by people who are dressed like me right now, sitting in their seats with their laptops with very similar presentations. So the demand for consultancy services, whether it is audit, whether it's strategy, management, consulting, recruitment, all these different areas, vastly outweighs what exists in the kingdom, and therefore all those businesses are growing. Same story for law firms. So this has been the case for a number of years that, for example, the UAE has had an extremely established legal market and legal network of global firms of every level. Um, these guys have been flying across to the kingdom and working on projects remotely. Everyone probably is aware of the various different laws that are in place now to incentivize companies to be based in the kingdom. Even at a very basic level, there are financial penalties for basing yourself elsewhere and effectively taking money out of the kingdom. So companies are not stupid. They want to factor that in. And if that means opening an office and investing in people on the ground, it's the highest growth market in the world. It would be stupid not to do that. There are certain sectors, law firms being one, where there have been legal changes as well that support those investments and that growth. But yeah, across the board, it's purely driven by the opportunity.
That's amazing. So, yes, Joe, thanks a ton for your time. Thank you so much for answering all our questions. And thank you, everyone, for joining in. I mean, it's been fun. I've learned so much. And thanks a lot. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chantal. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much. And to everyone watching, if you registered, I will send you a summary of the interview, because I know a lot of you would not be able to watch through the entire interview. So I'll send you the summary. I'll send you questions, the answers to all your questions as well, and we will make snippets of this video. So yeah, thanks so much. Thank you, everyone. Thanks a ton.
Thank you, guys. Take care.
Sure. Thank you.